Liz. Welcome back to my sewing room. Today I'm going to show you how to attach quilt binding while achieving a crisp, professional finish every time. Quilt binding isn't something that you hear regular people talk about. Have you ever heard someone say, "Did you see that beautiful quilt binding with the perfectly mitered corners?" And that's a shame, because the binding is what holds every beautiful quilt together. I prefer to bind my quilts and quilted projects by machine because it gives me a durable finish quickly. However, you may prefer to finish your quilts by hand if you're entering a show or just like the slow, relaxing pace. You can use the method I'm going to show you to finish your quilts by hand or machine with one simple modification. If you're finishing by hand, attach your binding strips to the front of your project first, and then you'll fold it over. If you're finishing by machine, you'll attach your strips to the back of your project first, and then fold it over to the front. Let's get started. The first thing I need to do is attach my binding to the project. You can use pins if you like, but you don't have to. The two places I like to pin are at the very beginning where I start sewing and right at the corner. This pin will tell me where to position my miter. I want it to be 1/4 inch in from the top and 1/4 inch in from the side of my project. So if you're looking at this, the pin should go in right there, and that will tell you where to begin your miter. If you're using pins, only pin one side at a time. If you fold your binding up and pin more than one side, it will bunch up as you're sewing and you'll need to reposition your pins later. Once your binding is in place, take your project to the machine and start sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can adjust your needle position if necessary. In this part of the project, it's important to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you think you're sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but instead are using a 3/8, you won't have as much fabric as you think when it's time to fold it over. Make sure you have a nice tail before you start sewing, and continue right to the corner where your pin is. Once you approach the pin, stop, back tack, and remove your project from the machine. This is where the process gets really interesting. To create your miter, you need to fold your binding up so you get a nice 45-degree crease. If you like, you can pin that fold in place, and then so you can sew this side, you want to fold the binding in the opposite direction, and you'll have a new fold that is parallel to the top of your project. If you like, you can pin this fold in place as well. And now when you start sewing, you'll start right at the top edge of your project. Bring your project back to the machine. And you'll sew all the way to the next corner. Mark where you want your miter to go. Sew, back tack, fold your binding upward, fold it back down, and keep sewing until you finish all of your corners. Now for the tricky part. As you approach the beginning where you started attaching your binding, it's time to stop. Make sure you leave a nice gap and remove your project from the machine. Now it's time to join the ends. There are two problems that can happen here. If you make the binding too tight, your quilt will pucker up like that. And if your binding is too loose, you'll have all this extra fabric to deal with when you fold it over. So it's important to find the point where your binding meets exactly. The method I like to use is I'll fold this one out, make a nice crisp angle right around 45 degrees, bring the other strip in to create a matching angle like that. Just finger press them to make a crease, lift it up, and then pin it together. You'll follow the crease when you stitch your ends. So you'll be going from here to here. If this is your first time, I suggest using a larger stitch so you can test the position. When you're sure that it lines flat, you can go over the stitch line with a smaller stitch around 1.8 or 2 millimeters. There's also another method that you can use if you prefer a really smooth and truly continuous finish. The first method I showed you is really great for small projects. You can do something as small as a coaster with no trouble. And on bigger projects, sometimes it's helpful to open the binding up, open your fold, fold this down to create another 45-degree crease, and then you'll open up the fold on the other one so they sort of lay on top of each other, and then you can lift them up and you can see your stitch line. Actually, your stitch line here will be right from this corner to that corner. You'll lay these back down, and once you stitch it, you'll be able to make a nice, clean, double fold. Some people who like this method think that the first method I showed you makes a bit of bulk, but really if you trim it a little bit, it's really not noticeable unless you try to find the point where these two ends meet. Once your ends are joined, the next thing you need to do is clip off the excess fabric and stitch down this little gap that is remaining. Once your binding is attached to one side, it's time to fold it over. Now that your binding is in place, flip your project over and bring it to the other side. You'll notice that there's some extra fabric at the corners of your project, and that will become your miter. This is a lot like the front. You can pin your binding in place if you prefer, but you don't have to. This process is pretty straightforward as long as you pay special attention to the corners. Right here, you want a nice 45-degree fold to extend beyond your project. The apex, the furthest most apex of this binding will become the center of your miter when you fold the other side in. Just pin it in place and continue that process on the other corners of your project. After your binding is pinned in place, you will edge stitch, making sure to keep your stitches as close to the edge as you can without driving yourself crazy. So I'll bring the project to the machine, lower the needle, and start sewing, just keeping it nice and close to the edge. When I get to the corner, I will stop and pivot, making sure to catch both layers of that mitered fold. Continue around the rest of your project until your binding is sewn completely down. If you're finishing your binding by machine, you'll see on the back you have a nice stitch line right next to your binding, just going into your project. That's really where you want it to be. If you swerve over your binding, like I did a little bit here, the best way to tell when that's happening is just listen to your machine, and when you're going over these 2 extra layers, you'll really hear more of like a thumping sound coming from your machine. And then when you swerve back into the good part, you'll hear that quiet down, and you really want to keep it right there so it's nice and unobtrusive. If you like, you can also finish your projects by hand. In that case, you'll treat your corners in the exact same way. Make the fold, make another double fold to create the miter, pin in place, and if you're sewing by hand, you just want to catch a few threads of your binding, a little bit of your project, and weave back and forth, making sure to keep those stitches really small, especially when you get right near the corner, and you'll just sew right through. I hope these methods show you how to bind your quilt perfectly for years to come. If you have any questions, share them in the comments area. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.